Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Leslie Jones. I'm the Director of Museum Affairs and Chief Curator for the Preservation Society of Newport County, and it is my honor to introduce tonight's speaker, Trudy Coxe, who is also my boss. She is the CEO and Executive Director of the Preservation Society, and she will be talking about the venerable architect Horace Trumbauer. Before I introduce Trudy, I want to remind everyone to please register for our next lecture by architect, architectural historian, author, and academic Drek Spurlock-Wilson, who will be discussing one of Trumbauer's most prolific associates, Julian Abel. I believe Mr. Spurlock is with us tonight, so thank you and hello. We're really happy that you're joining us, and we look forward to your lecture in 2 weeks. Remember also, if you are enjoying these lectures that we're bringing to you for free, please do consider supporting the Preservation Society by making a donation. It is very easy. If you visit newportmansions.org and go to the top right section of the homepage, there is a big button that says donate today. So if you can donate today or tomorrow or the next day, we'd sincerely appreciate it. Now on to tonight's lecture. As the leader of the Preservation Society of Newport County, Trudy Coxe oversees a collection of 11 historic house museums, including 7 of which that are National Historic Landmarks, spanning nearly 300 years of American architectural history. Prior to COVID, the Preservation Society of Newport County, also known as the Newport Mansions, had 400 full-time and seasonal employees, an annual operating budget of $25 million, 35,000 members, and it delivered over 1 million tours for 4 consecutive years. The Newport Mansions is the most visited cultural attraction in Rhode Island and ranks among the top 4 in New England. Trudy, at its helm, her key accomplishments are many, but a few highlights include raising $39 million as part of a recent comprehensive campaign, launching an aggressive plan to ensure the long-term preservation of the houses and eliminating a deferred maintenance bill of $13 million, achieving accreditation and later re-accreditation by the American Alliance of Museums, and establishing a fellows program for young scholars, many of whom you all have met as a part of our series. Immediately prior to joining the Preservation Society in December 1998, Trudy served 6 years as Massachusetts Secretary of Environmental Affairs, where she presided over completion of the Boston Harbor cleanup and creation of the next generation of clean drinking water technology, which protects more than 100,000 acres of land. Previously, she was the Executive Director of Rhode Island's Save the Bay for 11 years, turning it into the largest citizen action organization in New England. She also served for 2 years as the Director of Ocean and Coastal Resource Management in the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Like her accomplishments, Trudy's honors are also many, both in the awards she has received as well as the service she provides to the Newport and wider Rhode Island community. She serves on several boards and advises various companies ranging from environmental advocacy to commerce. Joining Trudy tonight, as you'll see on our screen, is distinguished local architect John Grosvenor, who has a passion for historic buildings, both through structural restorations and as a community organizer. As a multi-generational Newporter, John knows this city and its buildings through and through, and we're delighted to have him contribute to this evening's lecture. So welcome, Trudy and John.
Thank you so much, Leslie. That was very nice. And thank you all very much. I really want to thank John for joining me during the question and answer period. He's a great architect, a good historian, a wonderful painter, and anything that is complicated, John will take care of. Now, many of you had the opportunity to hear Sam White, and I think Sam might be on the line tonight, speak several weeks ago. I want you to know, Sam, that your speech received more emails and texts and calls than any speech we've ever had. So thank you very, very much for kicking off our winter series in such a dramatic way. Now, there is another side to the story, and that is that as soon as Sam finished his lecture, I sat down at my desk and wrote a memo to the file. And it said, if you are ever invited to speak following Sam White, say no. I am not an architect. I am not the great granddaughter of Horace Trumbauer, but Horace Trumbauer means a lot to me, and I'm going to explain why. I had the most incredible experience in having the opportunity to live in the first major house that Horace Trumbauer built, and that is Gray Towers, which is in Glenside, Pennsylvania. And I had the wonderful opportunity of living in Gray Towers in the turret, which was 310 degrees of windows around it. And every day when we went back to our rooms, we had to climb this glorious staircase, this coffered ceiling, 2 stories high, very monumental. And every room in Gray Towers was like the Elms. And this is where all of us girls would hang out and study and chat with each other. So this left a real impression on me. It has stuck with me forever. I love Horace Trumbauer. And I have to laugh because I was going to college at the same age that Horace Trumbauer was designing and building this building. So that's pretty remarkable. So tonight we are going to take a really quick trip through the life of Horace Trumbauer. And I want to ask you, if you remembered nothing else, please remember the following 3 things. The first is that this man is a true dyed-in-the-wool, self-made man. He had 8 years of schooling, nothing beyond that. He was then an errand boy and a draftsman for a local architectural firm, Hewitt and Hewitt. But what was most important was that he studied architecture at night. He taught himself architecture. And that discipline, that commitment, I think, stuck with him throughout his whole career. Second point, in the 1890s, you didn't have to be a trained architect to start an architectural firm. And so Horace Trumbauer started his firm when he was 21 years old, legally able to sign contracts. That's pretty amazing, but what is even more amazing is that within 1.5 years to 2 years, he was building buildings like Gray Towers. So self-made man, early success. And number 3, his body of work is prodigious. He created more than 1,000 buildings over his career, his firm did. Some massive in size and scale and detail. It is written in one of the articles that we read about Trumbauer that he honed the process of architecture until he could turn out an average of 1 work every 2 weeks over the course of his career. So this is a pretty remarkable man, and I'm honored to have the opportunity to talk about him. Now, the thing that we need to know about Trumbauer is that there's not a lot known about him. He was very private. He didn't do interviews. There are not many photographs about him. So the ones you see tonight are the ones we have. One thing, however, is clear. Horace Trumbauer was a fascinating, complicated man. His daughter described him as sort of manic depressive. Yet, against all odds, he excelled. He had no training, no fancy degree, no study abroad, no network of social connections, no money, and yet he created one triumphant masterpiece after another. On the family front, he married an older woman who had a daughter and took very good care of them, along with a very odd assortment of brothers and sisters. In fact, he set up trusts so that they could live off those trusts in the event of his death, live comfortably. On the work front, his philosophy was to hire the very best. He once said, "I hire my brains." And he went after students from the University of Pennsylvania School of Architecture and was successful in hiring the best because he paid his people better than any other architectural firm in the region. And they, his staff, at the height of his career, he had 30 people working for him. They were incredibly loyal to him. They often referred to him affectionately as the old man. Many stayed with him not for years, but for decades. And one of those people, a notable employee, was Julian Abel, who you will learn more about from Mr. Wilson in a few weeks. Julian Abel was the first African-American graduate from architecture school. He was nicknamed Willing and Able, and I think that drive and talent of Julian's was a perfect match to Horace Trumbauer's. They were collaborators on many projects over the decades, working together on projects like the building of Duke's campus and many other things, the Elms here in Newport. Now, there's been a lot of speculation about who did what in Trumbauer's firm, but just to show you the measure of Julian Abel, he once said, "The lines are all Mr. Trumbauer's, but the shadows are all mine." I think that's so poetic. Trumbauer suffered from an inferiority complex that many believe was due to his lack of a formal education. He was embarrassed about it. He was ashamed. He was afraid that he would get caught. And yet he was able to hold his own with business tycoons that he was working for. He was able to cajole them into spending lots of money and to build bigger. He could have been part of any social circle that he wanted to be, but he was not sociable. He was not clubbable. So in other words, if he had lived in Newport, he wouldn't have had any interest in Bailey's Beach. And it is written that he was innately adept, and I think this photograph shows it, innately adept at his profession, but he rather bumbled through the rest of his existence. He had some flaws. Later in life, he drank heavily, died at the age of 69 from cirrhosis of the liver, and took to his grave a love for gambling. The stock market, dice, you name it, he loved it. Yet, all these contradictions, all these complexities, he was able to create, and he created a lot. His ancestors came to the United States from Germany in the 1730s. He was very proud to be a family that arrived here early. And there is a town called Trumbauerstown in Pennsylvania. Bauer in German means farmer. His family were farmers. Some believe that his name was Trum. Others have written that his name might have been Trump. I tell you this just because of the irony of today. He was born in 1868 in the wake of the Civil War, way out in the countryside. His father moved the family to Jenkintown, Pennsylvania. His father became a dry goods salesman there. And Jenkintown is a suburb of Philadelphia, as you can see. It is a place where richer people were moving in the youth of Trumbauer. And this gave Trumbauer an opportunity to be exposed to some different social settings. And as I mentioned, when he finished the 8th grade, he started working for Hewitt & Hewitt and was exposed to all sorts of buildings that Hewitt & Hewitt were designing, like this one, Drummore Castle, which is on the outskirts of Philadelphia. And I often, when I look at this photograph, wonder, here he is, a 15, 16-year-old kid. I wonder if it was being exposed to massive buildings like this one with lots of ornamentation that might have given him the confidence to go on and build equally massive buildings, some of which you'll see tonight. When he started his firm in 1890, at the age of 21, he did everything from building barns to stables. He built a jail and even some carousels like this one in Willow Grove Park in Pennsylvania. His business took a huge quantum leap when he was hired by Wendell and Smith, a development firm. They asked him to design middle-class housing along the railroad tracks leading from Pennsylvania out into the suburbs, communities like Wayne and St. David's and Overbrook, and any Philadelphian knows these communities. And this activity would lead him to a name that you all know, Drexel, because Anthony J. Drexel was developing in the same way along those railroad lines. Now, I have to tell you, their idea of middle-class housing is very different from my idea of middle-class housing, because these are some of the buildings that were created. And they are beautiful, they're gorgeous. And still to this day, they are standing, they are coveted, people rent them, people buy them, everybody wants to live in these houses. Real testament to the work of Trumbauer, Wendell, Smith, and Mr. Drexel. Leaders, really, when you think about it, in creating what is today considered to be the very exclusive main line of Philadelphia. Important piece of history to understand, Trumbauer hit Pennsylvania at exactly the right time. Two factors were playing had a role in influencing him. In the 1890s, Philadelphia was changing radically. The old guard, the Quakers, the people who were prominent citizens of the time, they were people who downplayed their wealth. They avoided showiness. You know Quakers. At the same time, families like the Drexels and the Elkins and the Widners were beginning to make a lot of money. They had no hesitation in showing off their wealth, just like in Newport. It was a way of gaining prestige. So perhaps they couldn't get into the A-lists or the fancy circles, but they could make their mark. They could build bigger. They could build better. They could endow philanthropic institutions. And interestingly, Trumbauer was right there to help them. He understood these men. He knew how to achieve their goals. He knew how to transform their words and their aspirations into something that was real. In fact, he is sometimes referred to as the architect for the nouveau riche. Another factor that aided Trumbauer was that the architectural world was changing as well as a result of the World's Columbian Exhibition in Chicago in 1893. Remember, many Americans went to that fair, something like 18 million out of a population of 62 million. And many of these people who went came away with a love for the Beaux-Arts. First time they'd ever seen architecture of this style. And many asked, why can't American cities be like Paris or London or Madrid or Barcelona? And the Drexels and the Widners and the Elkins and the Vanderbilts and the Berwins believe that too. The beautifying of America. So there you have it. Trumbauer was at the right place at the right time. He understood the people he was working for. One historian observed that had Trumbauer started 10 years earlier or started 10 years later, this story might be a very different one, but he was there at the right time. His big break occurred in 1891 when some of his watercolors were seen by this man, William Welsh Harrison, who made his money from sugar, who hired Trumbauer to renovate his house named Rosedale Hall in Glenside, Pennsylvania. The house burned down, had nothing to do with Trumbauer. And Harrison then brought Trumbauer back to design a new house. He wanted a castle. And what was built was this one, Gray Towers. And at the time, it was one of the largest houses in America. So just think about this. Can you imagine being a 23-year-old creating one of America's most prestigious houses? He got his inspiration for Gray Towers from Alnwick Castle in Northumberland, Maine, not Maine, England. So here's Alnwick, here's Gray Towers. You can see some similarities. And he went from being a builder, designer of middle-class housing to a premier architect. In the mid-1890s, Trumbauer was hired by George W. Elkins, whose family made their money from gas and streetcars and railroads, to design Chelton House, which is a large stone, half-timbered Elizabethan-style house. The Elkinses were very much a part of the 19th century American entrepreneurial story. This house actually had a fire in 1908. Trumbauer was brought back to help rebuild it. And as you can see from the interior photos here, it has a lot of similarities to gray towers, the paneling, the decorative ceilings, the decoration all throughout. A beautiful, beautiful house. Now, George's father, William, wanted a house too. He wanted his house to be even bigger than his son's, and he wanted it to be built right next door. So he hired Trumbauer. Trumbauer designed Elstow, an Italian Renaissance palace, 45 rooms with an entire wing dedicated to Elkins's display of art. Allard and Sons, a name that you know from Newport, did much of the interior design work. Here you can see how luxurious this house was. Carved mahogany panels, frescoed ceilings, marble columns, crystal chandeliers, gilded molding. This is a Gilded Age mansion. And then in 1898, Peter A.B. Widener, a friend of the Elkinses, commissioned the now 30-year-old Trumbauer to design Linwood Hall. 300 acres of land, 50 structures, many of them built by Trumbauer, a horse farm, 110 rooms enclosed by Georgian limestone. Extensive classical detailing throughout. And here you see Linwood and its glorious gardens. It was a repository. Here's some of the interior details of the house. We have some interior pictures. Reminds you of some houses here in Newport, of course. Mr. Widener had a phenomenal collection of art, everything from Rembrandt to Vermeer to El Greco to Renoirs to Degas, Monets. So there were wings built for this art collection. That collection is now primarily in the hands of the National Gallery of Art in Washington. But it is said in the writings about Trumbauer that he went back to Linwood Hall often to work on it over a 3-decade period. It must have meant a lot to him. So I'm going to take a deep breath here for a reason. Some of you are Philadelphians, you know this story, but for those of you who are not Philadelphians, the fate of many of these early creations by Trumbauer, Linwood Hall here, the fate is very much up in the air. There have been many owners of all 3 houses throughout the years, the Dominican Sisters, it was boutique hotels, wellness centers, a lot of plans. None of them has been realized. And it reminds you of and here's Linwood Hall, by the way, what it looks like today. It's decaying away. And it reminds you of a quote by Percy Shelley, who said, "Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." The co-chairman of the Newport Symposium is George McNeely. I think he's on the line tonight. He is a Philadelphian, a historian, a writer, and he wrote an article, and I want to quote his words because I think they're so beautiful. He wrote in his article, "These houses were built as great monuments to the owners, to their owners, but instead we have these vast Gilded Age dinosaurs dozing in their gardens. They can be seen easily from nearby streets. Their futures are uncertain, so now is the time to go and admire them." George's message is very much the same message that we tried to publish when we published Lost Newport, which details out 59 masterpieces similar to Linwood and Cheltenham House that unfortunately have been lost to arson, vandalism, demolition, fire. And the message here, and I'm putting on my executive director's hat right now, is that it is really easy to lose great architecture. And it's the job of organizations like the Preservation Society, and it's the job of all of you who care about good architecture to do what we can to prevent that loss. Now, before I leave Philadelphia, I have to mention one of the most iconic buildings in Trumbauer's portfolio. I think everybody in the world knows this building, made famous by Rocky and Sylvester Stallone. Trumbauer collaborated with another architectural firm on the Philadelphia Museum of Art with Zanziger, Bori, and Metairie. The building took a long time to build. The wings, actually, they were very smart politically. They built the wings first in order to make it necessary to find the funds so they could fill in the center of the building. This building was started in 1919, and it was finished in 1928. And when it opened, it was panned. It was badly criticized. It was nicknamed the Great Greek Garage. Now, personal moment here. My grandparents lived on the main line and had an apartment in downtown Philadelphia, just off to the right of the right wing on your screen. So whenever we were driving them crazy, they sent us over to the Philadelphia Museum of Art. I know this place very, very well. And let me tell you, there is nothing more impressive than standing at the top of these famous steps and gazing down the dignified Benjamin Franklin Parkway towards the elegant Philadelphia City Hall anchored at the other end. No Great Greek Garage to me. I mentioned before the Widener family. Trumbauer's connection to the Wideners was generational. When the Titanic sailed from England in 1912, 3 Widener family members were on board: George and Eleanor Widener and their son, Harry. The father and son perished on board. Mrs. Widener, this beautiful woman, survived. Almost immediately, she hired Trumbauer to build a library in honor of her son, who graduated from Harvard in 1907, 5 years earlier. The Harry Elkins Widener Memorial Library at Harvard was the result. This project earned Trumbauer an honorary degree from Harvard in 1915, and in typical fashion, he declined to attend until Mrs. Widener put her foot down, and so Trumbauer arrived in Boston to accept his degree. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge was the keynote speaker at the dedication of the library, and he said, "This noble gift to learning comes to us with the shadow of a great sorrow resting on it." And I think you'd all agree that 105 years later, Trumbauer retained success in paying proper tribute to Harry Elkins Widener. Now, we cannot tonight look at all 1,000 buildings of Trumbauer's. I'm sorry, I wish we could, but I do want to make a brief stop in New York and introduce you to, Trumbauer actually created 14 buildings in New York, 7 of which still survive. This one, the Herbert Strauss House, is on 71st Street. Herbert's father also died on the Titanic, and he left his business to his sons. His business was Macy's. Herbert, one of the sons, hired Trumbauer to design this French Renaissance palace, 40 rooms. Unfortunately, Strauss died before the house was finished, and there have been a series of owners of this house over the years, the last being Jeffrey Epstein. So now the fate of this house is anyone's guess because it is locked up in legal battles and might be for a long time to come. So now we turn to Newport because there's a lot of Trumbauer in Newport. And some of these houses were built from scratch by Trumbauer, and some of them were alterations to existing houses. So I'm going to try to run through all of them. I want you to drive down Bellevue Avenue and around Newport and be very knowledgeable about every single one of these houses because they're important. You have to remember throughout the 1890s, Trumbauer's work ranged from, as you saw, Elizabethan style to Italian Renaissance to middle-class housing. But by 1901, when Edward Berwin brought Trumbauer to Newport, Edward Berwin from Philadelphia, and I'm going to talk about the Elms later, he landed on his preferred style, 18th century French classicism. This commission by Edward Berwin in Newport was really important because up to that point, most of the work that Trumbauer was doing was for Philadelphians in and around Philadelphia. He did a little bit outside of Philadelphia, but much of his work was Philadelphia-based. And it was really Berwin who opened up Trumbauer's world by introducing him to a well-heeled clientele from around the country. Two New Yorkers who loved the Elms were William and Annie Storrs Wells. They were part of New York's fabled 400 and were terribly impressed with Trumbauer's work, hired him, Trumbauer, to build them a house on the corner of Bellevue and Ruggles because their former house, Pansy Cottage, had burned down. This commission was an incredible breakthrough for Trumbauer. It took him into a brand new league. Chetwode, when it was built, it was inspired by a 1760s chateau near Dijon. And here you see a close-up. Its gardens were massive, taking up almost an entire city block. It was considered to be the most lavish house ever built in Newport. Interestingly, Trumbauer didn't face Chetwode towards Bellevue Avenue. He faced it south towards Ruggles, and he created a covered loggia on which people in the house could stand overlooking Bellevue Avenue to figure out what was going on in town. So who was on whose coach? It was all about seeing and being seen. And you can see from these vintage photographs, Chetwode's interior, 14th and Louis XIV and 15th interiors, influences, over the top decorations, an absolutely beautiful, beautiful house. You've seen this in Newport. The house was occupied by Mrs. Wells until the 1930s, when ill health forced her to sell to John Jacob Astor III, Jakey, fully furnished, all this property, the building and everything in it for $150,000. It was sold again, unfurnished, in 1957 for $40,000. And at that time, it was divided into apartments and remained as apartments until it was lost to a fire in 1972. So some Newporters may remember this glorious house. I have to tell you that this is one of those lost houses that really hurts. Fortunately for us, our former curator, Paul Miller, was impassioned by Chetwode, and whenever there was an object on the market from Chetwode, he would scurry around and make sure that we acquired it. So we do have some Chetwode objects in our collection. Want to come back to Mrs. Widener again. She and her husband had plans to build a house in Newport. You can see the W in the gate. He loses his life on the Titanic. She moves forward with Trumbauer to create Miramar. 27 bedrooms, 14 bathrooms, able to entertain as many as 700 people. Glorious house with equally glorious gardens, as you can see here. Now, Michael Catherines, who is the country's foremost expert on Trumbauer, and if you want to learn more about Trumbauer, you must acquire this book, American Splendor, because in this book, he says that Miramar is the purest expression of French 18th century neoclassicism extant outside of France. It is a triumph of Gallic architectural logic and refinement. It is sublime. It's a beautiful building. I'm showing you some vintage photographs from the period. And what it looks like today. This is a very special house to those of us at the Preservation Society because it was owned by David B. Ford, who was a member of the Board of Trustees of the Preservation Society. He was a phenomenal philanthropist. He was a great mentor, a really good friend, and he was a fantastic preservationist. And this house will never be lost because David poured his heart and soul into making sure that it was preserved and preserved well. So we miss this man very much. Another Trumbauer house. In the early 1900s, Edward C. Knight Jr. hired Trumbauer to create what was then called Clarendon Court. Mr. Knight's wife's name was Clara. Knight inherited his father's fortune, railroads, was less interested in business, more interested in, quote, looking good and spending the money his father had made. And here you see some vintage photos of Clarendon Court. Later owners changed the name. Vintage here. And what it looks like today. We all like to see people's houses, don't we? Well, Knight's wife, Clara, died in 1910. And in 1928, he commissioned Trumbauer to build him another house way out in the country, in Middletown. This Tudor-style Stony Brook, which would become one of Trumbauer's last noted residences. He's now approaching the end of his life. We are really lucky because a great supporter of Newport and of the Preservation Society is Sandra and Grenville Craig. They own Stony Brook, and until very recently, they owned Stanford White's Tilton House, which Sam shared with us a few weeks ago. And Mrs. Craig gave us a chance to visit last week, so I'll show you a little bit of the interior. Very gracious, beautiful hallway entrance. I'd love to live here. A very comfortable living room. Trumbauer used pickled pine throughout the house. The entire second floor has not been painted. It is still pickled pine. The detailing work in this house is phenomenal. The fireplace, the door jamb, the lighting fixtures. The Craigs have done a wonderful job in preserving this house. Commendations to you both. And what I think is so special, it is located so strategically on the water. I don't know of any house on Aquidneck Island that is this close to the water. So This is also another house that I doubt will ever be lost. Bravo to the Craigs. Another Trumbauer house, or a house that has his fingerprints, is Rough Point, which was originally built for Frederick Vanderbilt, the brother of Cornelius and William and George, you know that. It was a Peabody and Stearns house, finished in 1892, around the same time as Marble House. And it was bought by James Duke, seen here with his daughter, Doris, in 1923. Duke brought Trumbauer to Newport to make some additions to the house. He knew Trumbauer because Trumbauer designed this house for Duke in New York, 5th Avenue and 78th. And the addition that I want to concentrate on for a moment tonight is where the arrow is. It's the music room. Many of you know Rough Point. And you know that when you enter this room, you are entering something very different from the rest of the house. It's very light. It's very pretty. It's Trumbauer. And Mark Thompson, who is my colleague running the Restoration Foundation, does a phenomenal job in taking care of Rough Point and then all of the Doris Duke houses throughout Newport. Another Trumbauer house. Actually, not really. This house, Seaweed, was built in the 1860s. It was expanded in 1867 by George Champlin Mason, an architect that many Newporters know. It was bought by Tom Dolan, a Philadelphian, who brought Trumbauer here to expand the house and turn it into a colonial revival style house. And so here it is. And he named it Seaweed. The current owners of Seaweed are Holly Bannister, who is a member of our board, and Doug Newhouse. And they too have done a phenomenal job in caring for this house, preserving it. They won the Restoration Foundation's top award a few years ago. And when they got it, it was said that they were getting the award for taking a purist preservation approach, changing very little and restoring as much as possible. So Holly and Doug, congratulations to you. We have some really great preservationists in Newport. And then one final renovation project that I want to share with you is this Fair Home. This Tudor Revival style building was built in 1875 by Frank Furness. To the right of this building is the breakers, just to get you oriented. Here's another view of the house from the water. The Drexel family bought it in 1895. And they were great entertainers and hired Trumbauer to expand the building and create for them a ballroom. And it is said that they gave the most extravagant parties of anyone in Newport in this ballroom. And here are some vintage photographs of that ballroom. Please note the wall covering. It's so really pretty. And here is the ballroom today. And we'll get closer up to some of the wall covering, which has been restored, touched up. There you see it there. This house is owned by Sue Petrovas, who is a member of our board, and George Petrovas. By the way, I think you have to, in order to be on the board, you have to own a Trumbauer house. So Sandra Craig, you're in line. But they have done a wonderful job in taking care of this house. I want to commend them too. This is the Frank Furness part of the house, but I wanted to show you the entranceway just because Sue has done a beautiful job in caring for it. So I am coming to the end of my speech, and I have to talk about the Elms. And you'll remember that I said that it was Berwind who brought Trumbauer to Newport. and had him build this house. It was a real sensation overnight. It was so well received that the Elms was written up on the front cover of Scientific American, and it's a big spread in the middle of the magazine. And it was designed after a building in outside of Paris, Chateau Danier. Here you see it. Here's the Elms. Chateau Danier. I think you would agree that our Elms is slightly more elegant and has a little bit more presence than Chateau Danier. It's not as stubby or stocky. But this house, lets me tell you why the Preservation Society exists, because it was this house that was about to be lost in 1962. And a developer was going to tear it down and either put in a mall or a subdivision, we don't really know. And along comes our founder, Catherine Warren, who said, actually, we can't lose this house. We cannot afford to lose the Elms. And so she gathered 9 of her friends together, all 10 women, bought the Elms. The collection had been sold at an auction. So we are always on the lookout for bringing back objects from the Elms. So if you ever hear of something, please call us. And thank goodness for Catherine Warren. And here are some vintage photographs of the Elms. This was the library where Mr. Berwyn smoked cigars with his friends or did some business, and the library today. Here's the ballroom in 1927. And the ballroom today with the wonderful Boldini painting of Lady Decies over the mirror. The drawing room where they would have had their better objects on display. And the drawing room today. The painting in the ceiling did not go to auction because it was cemented to the ceiling. It's spring zephyr pushing winter away, which I think is a perfect allegory for a summer cottage. The main hall, the Elms main hall in 1901. Here it is today. I'm going to go back to Michael Catherine's, who writes in his book, this divided staircase with this Carrara marble and the wonderful wrought ironwork. It is one of the most beautiful staircases ever erected in the United States. And then Michael goes on to say, it sweeps one up to heaven. It's just pure poetry. I love that image because that's how you feel when you're on that staircase. The breakfast room in 1901. The breakfast room today, our conservators spent a lot of time. There are not many Chinese lacquer panels like this in the world. Perhaps the greatest collection of them is at Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna. Our conservators worked with those curators and conservators to bring these panels back. Commendations to them. The conservatory, then. The conservatory today, I love that ceiling. The dining room, this is the room in Newport where reputations were made and broken. And here you see those 2 massive paintings on the wall. They too did not go into the auction because they're cemented to the wall. Fortunately for us, they tell the story of the legendary Roman general Scipio Africanus. However, we lost in the auction the overdoor paintings. There are 6 of them. And for over 50 years, those overdoor paintings sat in Wildenstein in New York. And I'm showing you this gallery because this gallery was designed by Horace Trumbauer. And thanks to the wonderful support of people like Ala Isham, who I think is on the line tonight, and others, we were able to bring back, after more than 50 years, all 6 over-door paintings. Tremendous success story. So in 1914, Trumbauer rehired, actually 1911, Trumbauer rehired, Berwind rehired Trumbauer to design a stable and carriage house. And it was, the inspiration was this from France in 1897. And when it was built, it was said in a newspaper account that it was the, quote, most elaborate combination garage and stable in the country, where you could house 13 automobiles, 10 carriages, and 15 horses. We have spent a lot of time in the last few years restoring the carriage house. It is today a scholar center. 4 fellows live and work and research here. They're doing phenomenal work for us. And we couldn't have done this restoration were it not for some Berwin descendants, Susan Stoutberg and James Berwin, and many others of you might be on the line. Thank you very, very much. Our students love living there. We also took a major effort to restore the gardens, which over time had been lost. 3 major fountains gone completely. And in order to celebrate the centennial of the Elms in 1901, we began restoration of not only the fountains, but the entire garden. The lower garden, the sunken garden, was used for composting. And here you see some of the restoration underway. The fountains are coming back. Here's a vintage photograph of the grand allée of the Elms Garden with the sculpture. This is from 1914. And this is the garden today. I have to say, I think we did a darn good job. Really proud of this. And then a colorized version of the sunken garden, a little bit over the top. We're not sure it was quite like this, but again, we took a major effort to restore it, rehabilitate it, and this is the sunken garden today. So, coming to the end, income tax comes into place. Entertaining in the Gilded Age manner became much too expensive for most people. Lifestyles were changing. That happened as a result of World War I. There's a recession. The stock market fails in 1929, and firms like Trumbauer's don't make it. Trumbauer's does. And it's partly due to the fact that he still had a lot of work to do on the Duke campus, fortunately. And he was given some major commissions, Hahnemann Hospital, big projects. But I told you at the very beginning of this lecture that Trumbauer was a mysterious and complex man, an early success, a self-made man, prodigious in his work. I hope that from these pictures tonight, you can see why I really adore him. His buildings are monuments. They are trumpets announcing grandeur and beauty. And I think perhaps the greatest compliment that could ever be paid to Trumbauer comes from this man. Here are the houses again. Ogden Codman, a name that many of you know. He, with Edith Wharton, wrote The Decoration of Houses. And it was Ogden Codman who worked on the 2nd and 3rd floors of the breakers, did the interior design work, working under the great Richard Morris Hunt. But it was Ogden Codman who said that the only American architect whose work he admired was Horace Trumbauer. High praise. Thank you all very, very much. And we open it up now to questions. John is here to help me, and I really appreciate the time you've given me.
Thank you so much, Trudy. We have some great questions coming in. For those of you who'd like to add some questions to our conversation, There's the Q&A box that's at the bottom of your screen. If you'll just click on that, you can type in your questions and we will pose as many as possible to Trudy and John. We will start off with one that I think is directed more towards John. If Trumbauer did alterations and restoration to famed places like Seaweed, how does one approach editing another architect's work?
Well, you know, it's fascinating. And by the way, I just wanted to compliment Trudy. What an amazing lecture. That was just spectacular. And we all learned an incredible amount.
Thank you, John.
It was just beautiful. So talking about playing with another architect's building, I think there's one that I think few people realize actually involved Horace. And it's another Peabody and Stearns. As you recall from Trudy's comments, the rough point was Peabody and Stearns, and there's a big music room addition that Horace Trumbauer did. There is another building called Vinland, which is now owned by Salve, and is fascinating. And I wish I had a picture to show you, but he took the Peabody and Stearns building and incorporated a centerpiece that became really the entranceway to the entire building. And it's phenomenal. So I guess I'm going to answer the question by saying that it's a tribute that Peabody and Stearns stood by and allowed that he could come in and enjoy making what I think were beautiful buildings, perhaps even better. But he was extremely sensitive to how we massed them all together and did a spectacular job. His ego was not to be a signature building. You know, he really made sure that those buildings were monumental. It wasn't about him. It was really about the successful, thorough completeness of the design.
Thank you so much. We have a lot of similar questions coming in about Trumbauer's training and possible travel. So if he didn't have any formal training, how did he know so much about these historic styles that he copied in his architecture?
Right.
Did he ever travel to Europe?
I'm going to let John talk because I interviewed John on a radio show. I've talked to John actually several times about this because to me, an 8th grade education, I cannot imagine how one teaches architecture to oneself. I can understand learning Spanish on your own, but architecture, which is engineering, it's just unbelievable. So John, you have some viewpoints on this that I think are really valuable.
Right. I think what was happening at the time, you have to understand that it really wasn't until the 1860s to 1880s that architecture became a profession. Prior to this, it was the course of gilding through various apprenticeships, and oftentimes it was a master builder that brought all these together. So it was a brave new age. Architects were academically oriented. Many of them went to the École des Beaux-Arts in France to study and then would come back. Actually, Richard Morris Hunt was most celebrated really from that journey, and he was very persuasive, and many architects followed his lead. But in Horace Trumbauer's case, you know, at the age of 14, he dropped out of school. Age of 16, he's now apprenticing for an architect, and he obviously is an adroit, highly intelligent man and an amazing, voracious reader. And it is extraordinary. So when you look at articles that have been written about him, he had one of the most extensive libraries. And it became apparent that the whole field of architecture at this time, this is before arts and crafts, before modernism, it was really focused on the classics. And Horace Trumbauer made it his obligation to really study these books. And they're all actually, they're cataloged because they went for sale upon his death, but there was an extraordinary library of over 1,000 volumes of these enormous portfolio books. And he would take it to his 30-person firm and go through and everybody would enjoy reading the books, but the most prestigious reader of them all was actually Horace Trumbauer. So an extraordinary man that had that diligence. I think he's entrepreneurial. You know, if we had to take a look at how was he able to go forward, his inventiveness was not a new architectural style. His inventiveness was how to make what was classicism really seamless and work with the program. And he must have had a great way of flattering his clients because they kept coming back to him. But I think he's a developer at heart. I mean, I'll just say it. I know that's a bad word, but he was very entrepreneurial in how he approached programming and making things happen.
And you have to give him a lot of credit because to study that diligently and end up being able to do what he did, he must have been a very, very smart man.
Absolutely.
Well, that's another great question we have coming in too. The left versus the right brain of Horace Trumbauer, as he seemed very studious. Was he also technically an artist? And John, how common is it for architects like yourself to also be artists? I know the draftsmanship quality has to be in some sort of artistry itself, but.
And let me interrupt before John, you know, because it was the watercolors that Harrison, who built Gray Towers in Glenside, it was the watercolors that he discovered that got him so excited about Trumbauer. So I don't know about whether there's a collection of Trumbauer watercolors around. John, you are a great watercolor painter.
Well, thank you. No, I haven't seen many of Trumbauer's watercolors. I would love to see them, but I can only speak from the right-left brain. I think the painting allows the freedom. Now, if you look at a Beaux-Arts painting, those are meticulous and they are really structured, and the nuances are really about the lighting. But when you look at it, they always come off as poetic. And I think that must be the talent that Trumbauer put into his paintings, the power of how those spaces that he was developing would be lit, and all the detail that you could do with a gesture and a watercolor just really picks up that energy. So, you know, I think all architects should be artists. I mean, I just say that, but, you know, a lot of people disagree, but I do think there is that poetic aspect that we need not to lose sight of. Otherwise, we get all too engineering and focused on things that don't have the inspiration.
Absolutely. We have, I don't know if some of these participants are from Detroit or Michigan, but we have many people referencing actually one of my favorite Trumbauer sites. Trumbauer traveled all the way to Detroit to create Anna Dodge's Rose Terrace, which has now since been razed, but if anybody's interested to see how far west he went, Rose Terrace is a great Google search for images.
And well talked about in the Michael Catherine's book.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I couldn't do all of his houses or buildings.
You did an amazing job.
Let's see here. How would you situate the impact of Trumbauer's body of work and legacy compared to his peers? It's a great question.
Well, I'll let John answer this too, but you know, one of the things that you read about when you're reading about Trumbauer is that, you know, Trumbauer didn't get awards. I mean, yes, he got the degree from Harvard, but I don't really understand why he became a member. He was invited to be an AIA member very late in his career. He didn't get a lot of praise. People would say, oh, anybody can do a Trumbauer. Yeah, sure, anybody can do a Trumbauer. Was it jealousy, John? Was it because he was not a sociable person, so he wasn't hanging out with the other guys? Was it that he had incredibly high-end clients and people were jealous? What do you think was going on there?
I think it was a pathway that was not standard. You know, I think for the type of commission that he was able to get, it was unusual for non-academic to get that. And so I think there was a jealousy with his peers. We have licensing in architecture today. And I have to tell you that, you know, people who aren't licensed architects are generally not celebrated by architects. It's just the nature of all the trials and tribulations that are perceived that one has to go through in order to get licensed. And so that becomes kind of the standard. And I think in Trumbauer's case, licensing became really a big issue, and he was not able to actually overcome it. Although even today, you don't have to go through an accredited degree program, but you do have to go through a rigorous series of working for other architectural firms for many, many years before you can possibly get registered. So I think it is just that, you know, that basically he wasn't in academic circles. He was with entrepreneurial types, people who were nouveau riche, and they just decided that he was not worthy because he hadn't gone down the pathway where everybody else had to go in order to get licensed. And he took it kind of personally. You know, he, you know, brilliant as he was, obviously as talented as he was, he sort of held that cross throughout his life, and he felt this great sense of inferiority, even though he did amazing monumental buildings. Absolutely.
And I'm always struck whenever I think about him that here's this man who is insecure and doesn't feel worthy, and yet his clients are the biggest of the big. He's able to hold his own with these clients. He's able to talk them into spending lots of money. And that's why I say he's a complicated, complex, mysterious man. I just wish somebody had a diary out there because not a lot is written about him, and there's a lot to learn. But we learn from his buildings.
Beautifully, beautifully said.
We have quite a few people asking if you could expand, Trudy, on the story of the saving of the Elms by Mrs. Warren.
Well, again, we almost lost it in 1962. Julia Berwind, the sister of Edward Berwind, died in 1961 at the age of 95. And the house was left to a family member, but the family member wasn't interested in holding on to it, did not have a real connection to Newport. And so she went out and got her 9 girlfriends, if you will. It was bought for about $120,000. There was another piece of property attached to it. And right away, they had the ambition of opening the house to the public, but all of the objects and all of the furniture was gone. So imagine these women going around to their friends and collecting furniture and objects that would be worthy for the house, and then going to their friends at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and going to friends at the Museum of Fine Arts and convincing museums to loan things to the Preservation Society. And in a very short period of time, they had the Elms open for tours. So at that point in our history, we had Hunter House. We were managing and running the first floor of the Breakers. So our second real house was the Elms. And it was due very much to that incredible vision, I think, of Catherine Warren, who founded the organization in 1945 in order to save Hunter House. And then I'm sure she didn't start out intending to collect over time 11 properties, but that's what happened. And, you know, if you put what we've done in context to the 59 houses that were lost that are detailed out in Lost Newport, can you imagine how different Newport would be today had those houses not disappeared from our story, from our history? So you got to give those founders of this organization a lot of credit for having a vision. Remember, this is 1945, even early 1960s. 1945, we're not on our feet at all as a nation. We've just come out of a war. Newport's losing everything. The Navy is gone. And there are people, however, who are looking way down the road saying, we've got something really special here, and we have to do everything we can to protect it. And that's what our job is. And we need advocates like all of you, everybody on this line who cares. I wish I could be part-time in Philadelphia to fight on behalf of Linwood, and because these are beautiful buildings and they're part of our story, our American story.
It's a very inspiring story. And we actually have quite a few people, not just leaving questions, but also comments about how they want to help save a lot of these historic sites and wondering how to best do that. And I think it would be great for both Trudy and John to give that sage advice so that we can, actively make awareness about these important structures and their properties. Where does one begin?
Well, I think there are lots of ways. I think that you've got to keep your eye, John can answer this just as well as I. You've got to keep your eye out on what's happening in your community. You've got to pay attention to what's happening at governmental boards, the zoning board, the Historic District Commission, the planning board. I know people, those are pretty dreary meetings sometimes to attend, but you think about the former chairman of our board, Don Ross, who, when he stepped down from being the chairman of our board, put his name in to be a member of the Historic District Commission. There are things that you can do that are very concrete and that begin to guide and make sure that your community is being guided in a way. You can work on rules and regulations about demolition. You can work on rules and regulations about a look of a community or a look of a block, or what commercial buildings are going to look like, or where you're going to put parking. I mean, the list is endless. John, do you want to add to that?
Well, yeah, it's really something called sustainability, because what we're talking about are edifices worthy of being saved. And there's not an easy answer. And it depends on the economic times in order to make it work. So things like the Audrey building, which I think has gotten another sort of rebirth in terms of what has happened to its state. It was an office building. Bruce Price was the architect on it. It was his swan song. A spectacular terracotta structure. And it was just falling apart. It had just lost its series of statuary along the top. And with Nicholas Schorsch, he invested a great deal of energy and money and pure aesthetic into making this a preservation project. And I think that kind of adaptive reuse speaks volumes, because it would not be what it is today. And I think it has secured, perhaps another 100 years before it has to be saved again. So that is what happens. It isn't one answer for all time, but these buildings are really worthy of being kept alive. And we have to be creative in the approach on how to make them sustainable. And no different from what you do, Trudy. I mean, it's remarkable the number of buildings that are being saved, that are brought back, that would not be here. And we know that for your book and what has been taken away. So it's certainly a worthy cause. Absolutely spectacular. And the federal government's been very helpful too with tax credits. I just put that in there. People don't really like to talk about it, but there are many, many structures that are actually saved because the federal government has decided that preservation has a seat in history. That is something that is really important to go along with. And they've got a whole set of rules since 1976, and that program is very, very strong.
And I think, again, this is a personal thing, but, the examples that people like David Ford or the Petrovasses at Fairholme, or the Holly Bannister and Doug Newhouse, the Craigs with Stony Brook, they set just like, Catherine Warren, when she founded the Preservation Society, part of what the organization was doing was buying houses and then selling them only to people. So they were flipping houses, really, selling them only to people who they thought would preserve them. So they were grabbing things up to hold on to them. And when somebody came along, so we've got, I think, a real great group of people in Newport who are looking at buildings and saying, over my dead body is something bad going to happen to this glorious house. And we should praise them, laud them. Thank you, because you're keeping wonderful architecture around for many decades to come.
It's true.
I think that is the perfect way to wrap up this evening. Thank you, Trudy and John, so much. We have received so many wonderful compliments from all of our listeners and our viewers. So thank you all for tuning in. If you're interested in some of the books that Trudy was referring to, especially Lost Newport, you can visit our website, newportstyle.net. That is our retail website, where you can purchase copies of those books, or our Bannister's Wharf and Breakers locations are open, our retail shops. We have a variety of other great books that also detail Newport, many of which reference Horace Trumbauer as well. From all of us at the Preservation Society, thank you so much for spending your Thursday evening with us, and we look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you.